Hi there. The goal of this tutorial is to go through offline verifications and also the use cases where you might want to consider implementing it. There are two major use cases. The first one is where you cannot assume that your customer will be online at all times. For example, they might be offline for a few days or even just during the day. And the second use case is where they are permanently offline. And before we continue, I'd like to look at the key verification tutorial. And I'll use the Python example. However, this is similar in other languages as well. So the main thing in this example is the call to key.activate. This is where your customer has provided the license key, which you have added to this key parameter. And once this call is made, the result will be placed in the result. And after that, you can check for example, the expiry date, features. In this case, I'm checking that it's activated on the correct machine. So what happens under the hood is that key.activate sends a request to Cryptolens API. The API, assuming the license is valid, it will send the license object back to the client. In this case, it's a signed JSON object. And this is what allows you to then check some of the properties inside that object. However, since this is just an object, you can write it to disk and also load it from there. So let's look at the Python SDK library and see some of the methods that may be useful in this case. So once you've called key.activate, you can then use the method save a string to write it to disk. This can be anywhere. It can even be in a different storage format that you would prefer. So this will just return you the string and you can place it anywhere you want. And similarly, we can also load the license file back from the file into a Python object and later continue with the verification as we normally would if we would have called key.activate. So in this case, here you can see that I'm also checking that it's activated on the correct machine, and I can also obtain some of the features and the expiry date from that license file. So this is what's going to be important in what we're going to cover next. So as we mentioned in the beginning, there are two use cases. The one where your customers are assumed to be online for most of the time, but they might be offline occasionally. And the second use case is when they're completely offline. So in the first use case, a good practice is that, so in the first use case where we assume that they're online at most, or mostly online, but then that they might be offline due to specific reasons, for example, that they are in airplane mode or something like that. The default, a recommended strategy here is that you always attempt to perform key.activate, so to make that call. And if it succeeds, you proceed as normally. And if this would fail, this is where you would then be able to load the saved license file from disk. So the way it works, you call key.activate, you use the methods, for example, in Python SDK, save a string, and write down the latest license object. And whenever key.activate fails, you would then proceed and load the latest license object from disk, and then proceed with key verification from there. There are a few things that you can customize in this approach, and one of them is that you can customize how many days they can be offline. So if we scroll down to this example, you can see that there's a parameter we call load from string, and then we provide a parameter 30. So in this case, they will be able to use your software offline for 30 days. However, you can customize this to any date. So it can be just 3 days, or this can be customized in any ways. So that's the first approach with a scenario where you assume that the customers are online most of the times, but then can be some cases when they are offline. And I would say this is one of the ways it should be implemented. So key verification, if you're using the node lock licensing model, then having an approach where you always attempt to verify the license, write down the latest version of that license object, and then falling back on it in case there are some internet connectivity issues, That's a good practice when setting up key verifications in Cryptolens. So the second scenario, which we mentioned in the beginning, is the one where they're permanently offline. And there are a few ways to handle it, but since they're permanently offline, we'll not be able to use the call to key.activate, and instead we would have to send your customers the license file. And there are a few ways you can do it, and I will cover them all. So one of the ways, which is more advanced, and that is that you can call key.activate on your end, and then save the license object to a file, and then you can send them the license file, for example, over email, or even have an automated setup where there's a dashboard where your customers can request a license file. You call them key.activate and then send them the license file that they can insert on the right machine. An easier way of doing it is to use activation forms, which we provide. And this is essentially similar to the approach where you would call key.activate on your end. However, we provide a GUI that you can use instead. So they would provide the license key, the machine code, activate, and then they would obtain the license file that they can insert on their machines. Another approach is to download this license file from the dashboard. So we'd go to, for example, let's suppose that this is the license key that we want to generate the license file for. We can click on this yellow icon and then click on download activation file. And then you can send it from here. So let me see. So these are the three cases we've covered. And the final case I think I also like to mention is that for the customers that are completely permanently offline, that's also useful to keep in mind is, so these approaches that I've described, they are useful if the number of customers or like employees at site are very few who would use this offline. However, if we can assume that your customers will have, let's say, 100 users on site that need to be in an offline environment, then it could be useful to use the license server, on-premise license server that we provide. Either if you can anticipate that there will be many end users, or if you would like to support a floating license model. So to briefly sum up, we've discussed the offline verification example, so this tutorial, and we've seen that there are two ways of setting up offline verifications. The first one is where we can assume that your customers can connect to the internet at some points, but that they are allowed to be offline for a specific set of days. And the second example is where they are completely offline. But in both of the cases, the whole idea rests on the fact that when you call key.activate, you get an object that you can then save to disk. And then whenever they're offline, either if they're offline occasionally or if they're permanently offline, you can use some of the methods that our libraries provide to load it from disk instead of having to call the API. Thank you so much for watching. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out.